Dear listeners of the Female Guides Requested podcast, happy Wednesday. This is the third episode of the Everything SPI series. And yes, I'm your host Ting Ting from sunny Las Vegas. Today we have a guest from the AMGA office, Andrew Megas Russell. Andrew is the AMGA Climbing Instructor Program Manager. He oversees the single pitch and climbing wall instructor programs. The main topic of the episode was the new evaluation system. We talk about the background of transitioning from the old system to the new system and what the AMGA is trying to accomplish with the new system. We looked at the new scoring system and what factors would impact the score. We discussed how the new system has been received by the providers and candidates. We also talk about other general topics such as high standard versus minimum standard, continuing future improvements on the SPI program, interesting stats, and exciting upcoming changes. So thank you so much, Andrew, to come on the show, Female Guys Requested podcast. I'm doing this mini-series within the show to talk about SPI. So that's the reason I invited you.
Well, thanks so much for the invite. I'm very excited to be here.
Of course, I know who you are, but just for the audience, can you just briefly talk about yourself? Why that when we are talking about SPI that you are an important person to talk with?
Yeah, sure thing. Thanks again for having me here. My name is Andrew Megas Russell, and I can be referred to with he, him pronouns. I live in Longmont, Colorado, which is a suburb of Boulder, which is where I work. I work for the AMGA full-time as the Climbing Instructor Program Manager, which is this incredible opportunity to manage the single pitch and climbing wall instructor programs. And I've been in my role for about 5 years with AMGA. And before that, I was working for Knowles, the National Outdoor Leadership School, for about a decade. During that time, I also earned my rock guide certification with AMGA. Before that, I started climbing in the late 90s, and it's been a passion of mine, and I just really have always enjoyed sharing that passion with people. So it's great to be involved in the management of a program that has an impact on so many aspiring climbing instructors and guides. So yeah, that's a little bit of me.
Wow, Andrew, you have been on this position for 5 years.
Yeah, it's crazy how time flies, huh?
Yes, I would have to say that it was very easy to work with you, and you have done a fantastic job.
Thank you.
And so first thing first, I think the main focus I want to do for this episode is I want to do a little bit discussion about the new evaluation system, so which has been put in practice the start of this year, 2024. And
Yeah.
I know that we have done a lot of preparation, and then we have a lot of Zoom meeting and all that. So just make sure that all the providers are on the same page. But just to do a brief intro, can you just talk about the little history of the old system, maybe the old system, the new system? Why is there a need for the transition? And then how do we I should say why we would think that the new system is better.
The new system is better for so many reasons, but it maybe isn't perfect, and will continue. All these things are a work in progress. And I guess the old system originally at AMGA, there were 9 assessment categories, and those 9 assessment categories were utilized to critique or evaluate candidates who wanted to become mountain guides. In I want to say around 2008, the development of the SPI came about. There was a predecessor to that. But originally, all the assessment categories were kind of mirrored from the mountain guide program over to the climbing instructor program to consistency. And that's I think one of the strengths of the AMGA is that the association provides this incredible track for the climbing instructor in the, climbing wall environment, and it goes all the way up to the international mountain guide. So, that's where AMGA really shines compared to other organizations. You really can't hit a dead end at AMGA. There's opportunities to grow infinitely. But those original 9 assessment categories were critiqued. They were assessed with 3 scores. And so these original scores were pass, marginal, and no pass. And I think within that, there were a certain number of marginals or no passes. One were to receive, they would not pass the program. And there's just, I think it was a little tricky to figure out, well, one assessor's pass might be a little different than someone else's pass, and someone's marginal might be a little different than someone else's marginal. So we've shifted in 2020 during the COVID pandemic. The mountain guide program, AMGA received some funding, some government federal funding during COVID, and we were able to, while programs were paused, we were able to hire some instructor team members in the program to essentially revamp those assessment categories in the Eval template and the scoring scale. And so the mountain guide program received a major overhaul. It was an incredible feat that a bunch of instructor team members put time into, technical director, operations director. And it took me a couple years to kind of catch up and utilize the same framework and kind of transition that same framework to the climbing instructor program. And so I've been able to start with the SPI. I was able to gain support from probably about 8 or so providers around the country, backgrounds and experience level. And we developed assessment categories and scoring scale and eval templates that were a bit more catered to the instructor program. And so we're hoping down the road here to also develop the same framework for the climbing wall instructor certification program. So we're not there yet, but we're hoping to soon. And yeah, I guess just keep transitioning into the overview of that system. Those assessment categories for the SPI as it stands right now are risk management, technical system, movement, professionalism, and instructional technique. And there are a couple slight differences from the mountain guide program, but overall the framework is quite similar.
So it all started with a change in mountain guide program.
Correct.
And
Yeah.
okay, so back then it's all like focus on mountain guide program. And then at that time they didn't include the SPI program quite yet. And was that you that took the initiative, or it was the plan originally to change the SPI evaluation
Yeah.
system?
Yeah, the plan was to change SPI, but there are subtle differences within the AMGA in that mountain guide programs are staffed and employed and kind of run internally at AMGA. They're, the team members that are facilitating those programs are employed and paid by AMGA. And so during COVID, that was bit kind of a natural way to pay these already employees work on this system. And so I'm in a little bit different boat where the SPI program actually somewhat almost third-party run. They're AMGA programs, but the providers that teach these programs aren't employees of the AMGA. They're essentially contractors that are endorsed by the AMGA to, teach the SPI course curriculum and administer the certification. So it's a little bit more complex, in that I just don't necessarily have employees I can hire right away. It's a little bit more nuanced. I was able to get some great volunteerism from some committed providers for the initial overhaul. And then from there, it's just been a bunch of work on my end and work with our technical director, Dale Remsburg, and Jane Susi, who's now the deputy director at AMGA. So it's a big lift there. And then a couple shout outs to Elena Arenz and Jason Martin, who are both providers as well. They really had a big hand in helping me with the development of the new process as well.
So, is my understanding correct that so right now the mountain guide program also have 5 categories to evaluate their students?
Yeah, the mountain guide program's just subtly different. I believe I want to say they have 6 categories. One category and it's interesting because we originally had 9 categories, and things like mountain sense was a assessment category, and terrain assessment, or I think it was terrain management or terrain assessment. Uh, those are no longer listed kind of explicitly in the SPI assessment categories, but the qualities from those assessment categories have been absorbed into other categories. So they haven't disappeared, like, say, client care was one of the original assessment categories. That hasn't disappeared within the single pitch instructor program, but rather qualities of client care are now present in professionalism. They might be present in instructional technique, risk management. And so the effort was to just simplify the overall categories. And I can pull up the mountain guide program categories here in just a second.
Yeah, basically, I'm just curious because I know that we are trying to align so within the AMGA about the evaluation system of the mountain guide program and the SPI program. I mean, they are similar, they have subtle differences, but they are not, say, dramatically different. So that's my understanding. And so the old system, would you say the difficulty of using the old system is the categories are kind of overlapping a little too much, and then because the pass, non-pass, and marginal is kind of coarse divided, so it allows a lot of discrepancies of interpretations between, say, instructors.
Exactly. Yeah, that's well said. Trying to say earlier, yeah, it can definitely allow for those discrepancies. And now that we have actual competency scale for courses, and we have a scoring scale 1 through 10 for the assessments, and that is a way that we're able to better articulate where someone kind of lands with their skill set.
Great. So 1 to 10, you said that within the 5 category, like risk management, movement, technical skills, instructional skill, and professionalism.
Correct. Yeah, it's a 1 through 10 scale scoring scale for the SPI assessment, and it's the same for mountain guide programs on those exam level programs. It's a 1 through 10 scoring scale. And I pulled up the proficiencies here just as a reminder. I mentioned the SPI's risk management, technical movement, professionalism, instructional technique, and the mountain guide program currently is risk management, client care, technical systems, terrain management, movement, and professionalism. And so I believe they have instructional technique is absorbed into elements of, professionalism, risk management, client care, things like that. And within the work group, when we overhauled the SPI programs, and scoring scale and assessment categories, deemed that kind of keeping instructional technique in was really important. So those are a couple of the subtle differences. But overall, things, transfer pretty well from an SPI moving into a mountain guide program.
Well, they make a lot of sense to me because I was wondering about the mountain guide program. The instructional skill is a little bit hard to be a standalone category,
Sure.
but it's very important for the SPI since SPI has the instructor in the name, and so which means that teaching and instructing is a very big part of the program.
Certainly.
And question I would like to ask is because every time I teach a SPI program, right, or at the beginning of the SPI assessment, I like to explain the evaluation system to the participants. And I'm still trying to find the best wording to tell them that it's not a deduction. It's more like accumulation of your competency points so that because we still can score, say, 100 points, right? And the traditional sense as if like, okay, if you don't score 100 points, it means you are doing something wrong. But then it's actually not the case. It's actually we are trying to observe so they reach a level of competency. So we think that they are good to go for their assessment. So I'm trying to see how's like the best wording to describe to convey the concept to the participants.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a good point. It's a subtle shift from our traditional thinking in traditional classroom setting where everyone's trying to get their A plus, the 100% on their final exam or whatnot. And within the program here, Jason Martin mentioned this in one of our seminars that we were doing, our webinars online, one of the provider training webinars, and that he said, I think one misperception with the grading systems that we're used to the idea that we can get up to 100%. That may be the case in school, but maybe a better way to think of this here is that we want our students to mean, not a score. So that is just a subtle shift in thinking there. But the 62%, which sounds low, I think, whoa, 62, that's pretty low. But that is the minimum passing score. And with any category, there's a minimum passing score. So even though overall 62% is the minimum passing score, candidates are required to earn at least a 70% in risk management and then a 60% in all the other categories, which I believe in the end kind of equates to me like 62 or 65%, something like that. That's the minimum score. So that's kind of at the standard. And then there's room to excel and demonstrate, ability above the standard and then below the standard.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. I just realized that before I ask that question, I should explain the 100 point first. But you lay out, so you say the risk management, you need to score above 70%, and then the rest of the category 60%. But for the all category, the average should be above 62%.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
And I would say it's almost impossible to score like 100%. It's kind of out and beyond this. I really performing, and then I would say even I teach SPI program for so long, I myself might not score 100% because people make mistake all the time. That's why we climbing system have redundancy building all the time.
Yeah.
And
within the one thing I also like to mention to candidates is that within the 1 through 10 scoring scale, I don't think we mentioned this earlier, but seven to passing scores are in the 7 to 8 range. 6 is substandard. Within that, I think of there being 4 elements within this scoring scale. So for each score from 1 to 10, there's 4 kind of things that may or may not be impacted. One is how much coaching is required or intervention is required. So if a candidate is doing something without any coaching and they're very autonomous, then that's going to score higher. Another area with this would be their error correction. If they're able to minimize errors, recognize errors, fix errors, or if they're lacking in any notice or ability to correct the errors, that's going to be another element that impacts the score. A third thing would be risk management. If risk management is compromised, then that's going to impact their score as well. And then a fourth element within each score is the client experience or the person that the instructor's working with, is what they're doing impacting the client's experience. So those are kind of the 4 little delineators. And for some of the scores, there might be emphasis on a couple of those things. And some of the scores, there might be emphasis on maybe different things, maybe really highlighted. And that's why someone scored substandard. Maybe And so yeah, so those are some of the elements when you read through the scoring scale. Those are the elements that are kind of highlighted as you increase from 1 to 10.
Awesome. So right now at this point, it's July 3rd. Is it 3rd? Yes. So we have implemented this new system for slightly over a half year at this moment. I'm very curious of how it plays out. I personally really like the new system, and I appreciate that we went through. At that time, I feel it's quite lengthy practice of the evaluation. That so we have all the provider in the Zoom meeting, and then we have case studies. So we all evaluate, just like, okay, score 9, 10, 7, and try to see that whether we are consistent. But after that, because I ran the SPI assessment, I think first half of the year, and I just said, wow, I really feel very prepared for the evaluation, and I really like the simplicity of it. But I'm curious about how other providers think, because I won't hear them. I bet that you probably heard them. So I would love you to share a little bit about what you have observed or what you have heard from other providers, and what are the commonly asked questions still about the new system.
Uh, Great question. Overall, it's been widely, really well received amongst candidates and providers alike. Um, Everyone's been very excited for the new system and very curious about it. And I think the transition's been going pretty well from my perspective. That's been one of the big challenges is trying to, train or educate, pass on some beta on how to use this new system to, 80 SPI providers around the country. And so, yeah, the webinar that you alluded to, where I had some kind of case studies, and everyone there were probably 30 or 40 providers on the call, and everyone got to like vote in the Zoom and compare what they thought the score was, and it was really cool. And that was like one step. The refresher trainings that we've hosted a couple so far this year. There's probably been another 25 30 of those providers who've been involved in refreshers, including yourself, Ting Ting. That's been another great hands-on way to get involved with eval writing and training providers on, utilizing this new system and how to write evals effectively with the new system. So overall, I think it's been going pretty well. I've got another Zoom call scheduled for providers in, I want to say August 1st. It's maybe a month from now. Uh, April through June is generally the peak for SPI and CWI programs. So we've just come through our peak season. Things kind of plateau a little bit through the summer in terms of program and participant numbers. And so going to take this opportunity to meet up with some providers, reflect on how the first round of using the evals has gone, and then see what pieces of feedback people have, what tips they want to share with each other, and a few things share with people, and then that'll carry us into the fall season, which is kind of our second peak season on programs. Rocktober, you can think of the fall as a second season, so we'll carry into that. But yeah, I think it's been going pretty well so far.
You provide a video for providers about the tips for evaluation writing. So we still have to write down stuff, obviously, not just like score 1
Yeah,
to 10. Um, so can you briefly talk about it a little bit? Just like what is a strong evaluation, in my opinion?
yeah. Strong evaluation would be one that's objective and digestible. I think those are the two key components of an effective eval. And we can get into like all the elements of what make effective feedback, and people probably have acronyms they like to use, but for the most part, our original eval with the 9 assessment categories, there were over 11 spaces, paragraph spaces on that old eval to write down. So it became very wordy, and there were a lot of opportunities to, capture examples or observations, but it ended up at the end of the day, it was a lot of writing on the provider's behalf. And That can be really kind of time. It can take a lot of time, can be efficient, and I think the reader can get lost in so much of that narrative. So with the new format, we have condensed the narrative to, I believe it's like 3 sections for the maybe it's 2 sections for the course and 4 sections for the assessment. And there are opportunities to write for day one on the assessment, day two on the assessment, but there are also scores associated with that. So within those narrative blocks, really trying to encourage providers to try to capture themes. And so I think bullet points work really well. So, hey, risk management, here are some areas that didn't go so well. And then here's some things that did go well. And being able to kind of capture those brushstrokes on what the themes are, but with some specificity. I think that's the biggest challenge. Providers, I think historically we've gotten very detailed with on this day at this time, so and so placed the number 2 cam, and this happened, and try to focus a little bit broader on, better adequate protection or, holistic protection on your lead, something like that. So trying to focus a bit more on broader takeaways so that candidate doesn't get overwhelmed with all the feedback. I think if we have these 1,000-word narratives in our evals, they're going to get lost in that and not really know what to do moving forward.
Awesome. I
Yeah.
really like, obviously, objectivity is obvious, you know, and but I like that you use the word digestible because I remember in the old system, and because all the categories are kind of overlap quite a lot, and I was just like, should I even write the same thing here in this category because I already mentioned another category? So just like you said, can become like wordy. I was just like, who is gonna read this? I that's kind of like myself little conversation within myself. So now with like I can focus more on the big picture. So make sure that maybe not all the detail will be taken away, but at least the big picture direction can be taken away. I don't know whether that
Yeah.
was the intention too.
Yeah, because our debriefs are an opportunity to share those notes. Like the debrief can, get everyone away from the cliff. We're back in the park or at the trailhead. We can then have individual check-ins with our candidates and share some feedback, kind of that's relevant in the moment. And that's when we can talk through our details. But I think we don't need to carry that into the evaluation. It's hyper detailed. We can kind of start to broaden that a little bit.
Nice.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think the objectivity is important too. So one classic example would say someone might write down, oh, such and such candidate looks confident. They were confident in their climbing movement. And trying to move away from that, that's our perception, but we can rather use more descriptive terms that are objective, like climbing with rhythm, balance, and momentum at the required climbing grade. So that's a way we can kind of describe what they're doing rather than just putting that in this, I don't know, presumptive. Someone looks confident. It's like, what is confident? Let's try to actually put those elements because it's really hard to know.
I see. So if I said that somebody look confident when they climb, it's kind of how I feel, but it's not the
Exactly.
facts that I observe.
Yeah, it's how you feel. It could also be your bias. Like I might have a bias towards, men, or I might have a bias towards people with brown hair or something like that, or might have a bias towards someone who has a mammut harness on or something. So trying to pass our biases and
Good
really
job
just
plugging in there.
trying to just describe what the elements that people are doing.
And
Yeah.
I'm curious, of course, that so people, participants, if they have question about the evaluation, even though we try very hard to explain everything during the individual debrief after the course or exam, and and then we write the evaluation, but people can still appeal the result will
Yeah,
be.
there's technically not an appeal process for SPI programs. There are occasionally candidates who will reach out to me and we'll have a dialogue. Maybe they didn't agree with their eval and or they're frustrated with the result, and it may be an opportunity for myself and other folks from AMGA to check in with that person, and I will check in with the provider, the assessor, and try to figure out what where people are coming from and what we could maybe do different moving forward, if anything. There's an appeal process with the Mountain Guide program, but those programs are a bit longer, and it's just a little bit of a different process within the SPI program.
So right now, is there's no official way of appeal, but people certainly can reach out to you, and then you probably will have a conversation with, say, the people who are involved.
Yeah, yeah, and I would recommend candidates, if at all possible, and um, the provider ideally is fostering an open, dialogue, an open environment that is inviting for the candidate to approach them and speak further, clarify, et cetera, et cetera. Um, and if they don't feel comfortable, they could always reach out to me directly. But I think that's where there's elements of professionalism that come into play, if at all possible.
I
But it's a
see.
tricky thing. It's hard to not pass a program. I mean, that's a lot of we talk, it's a lot of time and money and resources, and it can be really challenging to not pass an exam. So yeah, I definitely want folks to know that I'm available and here is a resource. And if they don't feel like they can reach out to their provider, but ideally, that's the best case is they're able to have a dialogue and clarify feedback and um, yeah, and move forward in that way.
Great. I don't know whether this statement is correct. So I would say SPI is commonly considered as an entry level program. So they can stop there, but if they want to go toward the mountain guide program, probably it's also not necessary but recommended to take SPI first. Is this correct?
Yeah, it's not required to take the SPI before you take, say, a rock guide course or an alpine skill course or something like that. But statistically, I think it's around 82% of rock guide course students have had some involvement with the SPI. So the SPI is definitely, I think of it as a really foundational program for recreational climbers who are looking to become professional climbing instructors. And it's a great foundation, building block of all these, round skills and habits that they can embrace and practice in their daily climbing, recreational climbing, and then that can, go on to the rock guide course or these higher level programs. And the rock guide course for listeners, I guess, is going to be more multi-pitch focused, not typically long routes, but kind of break that multi-pitch guiding realm. So
I would say many people have this conception of guiding and instructing are like two different roles, which are kind of because a lot of time people ask me about Ting Ting, are you guiding or and then they would assume that there's no instruction involved, or if I am just instructing, then there's no guiding involved. And sometimes I confuse myself because I feel like a lot of time I play both roles in the situation, but it's a little bit hard for me to find the definition of these two words since they are in the spectrum. I don't know what you said, what you think.
yeah, I mean, I think I agree with you. I feel like guides and instructors can wear hats all the time. But I think of there being different ways to frame it. Maybe like the capital letter guide, capital G guide, and the capital I instructor. Like maybe someone's an AMGA single pitch instructor. They're certified in that discipline. And so that might be more of that capital letter I where they're maybe more focused on instruction, and maybe a guide or a AMGA guide might be more focused on or specialized in guiding long grade 5, 510, whatever multi-pitch objectives. And so I think those are ways we can kind of put those people into a box. But in reality, both of those guides and instructors are likely to have some days in their career that have a greater emphasis on teaching and other days that have a greater emphasis on getting to the top of the mountain.
Okay, so that probably that's the distinguished people think is like, okay, getting up to a certain route or mountain is like guiding, and then
Yeah,
learning the skills more like instructing.
yeah. But I mean, we could get even more meta with it, with like guiding is like guiding towards their objective. But that objective, it could be like a tangible route or mountain, but it could also be maybe skills. Like maybe we're guiding someone towards first lead climb. And that's where we might more so categorize that as instructing.
I see. The reason I'm trying to distinguish these two words and ask you all these questions is some people will come to SPI program and they say their interest is to only to teach. They say, oh, I would never want to be a guide, say.
Mm-hmm.
And some people even complain, say, oh, so for example, they are very inspired. They want to eventually become a provider themselves. And then they just like, why do I have to go through the mountain guide program
Mm.
in order in the future that I can be a SPI provider? So I'm trying to like figure out this commonly asked questions of, I certainly feel that in order to be a SPI provider, it's definitely very nice to have operate in more terrain, I would say, or the longer terrain, longer routes over different type of rock type and everything. But what's your take on this? Do you get asked about these questions too?
Yeah, and so I guess to clarify, we if someone wants to become an SPI provider of the curriculum and teach SPI programs, AMGA is looking one of the prerequisites looking for those candidates to have a baseline terminal certification at AMGA in the rock discipline. So that could be a rock instructor certification, which is kind of a cert that's not really being administered anymore, but it's been kind of like legacied into where we're at. So there's the rock instructor, there's the multi-pitch instructor, which is kind of the newer version of the rock instructor. So multi-pitch instructor is someone guiding or multi-pitch instructing, but it's going to be terrain that's not going to involve a significant amount of complexity or commitment level. And then the other would be a rock guide, an AMGA rock guide or an IFMGA guide. So we are looking for a certification. And I think like elements within that, someone could be a multi-pitch instructor. Doesn't mean they're guiding all the time. A multi-pitch instructor could be bringing people on 3-4 pitch routes and as a classroom setting, really educating people. I mean, that's what I did for years at Knowles in my tenure there. So it doesn't mean someone needs to be a guide in order to become a provider. It's more so they were looking for these people to have a higher level of training than what they're assessing on. And so I think that's like, you could think of maybe the collegiate framework where a professor of a certain curriculum is probably not an undergrad teaching undergrads. They're going to have a higher level of training so they can pass on some I guess mentorship or whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, nice. I have this question here. I'm looking at my note. Um, I think one of the common critique there out there is, I mean, I think AMGA right now does have a very strong reputation, and but I have heard just like, wow, AMGA is pumping out like a lot of SPIs, and I think SPI is tricky because I have seen super strong SPIs, like they are just super strong SPIs, but however the prerequisite of taking the SPI program it's not super high because that's an entry level. So we want to encourage people. Probably, if they want to become a climbing instructor, then they have accumulated some experience to already learn how to instruct, which can help their personal climbing, can also have a long-term effect if they eventually want to get higher certification. So I really enjoying that, but somehow then people start to have this say, oh, there's so many like SPI, they are not like AMGA standard. In a thing that's kind of nice because then people start to think that AMGA has this high standard. But in another thing, I would like to explain to people just like, well, SPI the skill level can vary a lot just because some people, they have maybe a year of experience, they will come into the program. And some people are more conservative, so they wait for so long, they gain a lot more experience before they come into the SPI program. So I was just wondering how you address this question when you see the criteria or you just ignore that.
I mean, I'm still a student of the craft. I mean, I'm learning things all the time from providers that I work with, from the students that I work with. I'm an assistant alpine guide, so I'm pursuing my alpine guide certification. And yeah, I think within that, it's just a personal pursuit of how prepared or over prepared or prepared you are. My personal style is to over prepare and to climb way more that are required on the resume. And I think that's one way to think about it, whether we have a high standard or whether we have a minimum standard. I think of it more of a minimum standard that we have. And for the SPI course, it's having led 15 traditionally protected climbs. Sure, that might not be too many, but hopefully people are exceeding that minimum standard, especially going into the exam when we're looking for candidates to have led 40 trad climbs. And I try to remind folks that that's the minimum standard that we would hope people are, they're likely going to succeed better if they have more experience than the minimum standard. But we don't necessarily require more than the minimum standard, but it's pretty common people will be set up for success if they exceed the minimum standard. I think one other thing to mention, you talked about the amount of SPIs like being pumped out in the program. And I think looking at last year's numbers from 2023, we had about 541 SPI exam candidates. 170 of those people passed. So there were 71 people who did not pass the SPI exam last year. And I think the pass rate, so that's around 87% of candidates. And it's similar to the Mountain Guide program. I think the Mountain Guide program in total, like last year, had around 700 students overall. And so SPI, we had about 530. The course was an additional 765 students. So all said and done, that's over 1,000 people involved in the SPI program, but only 541 of them were involved in the exam.
I see. Other than you mentioned that you would do some work on the evaluations system for the CWI program, which is the climbing wall instructor program. What other is in the plan for future improvement of the overall climbing instructor program?
I'm so glad you asked this question, Ting Ting. I was hoping we could share a few things for the future because there are three really key pillars, elements to these programs and helping people understand what's expected of them. And so prerequisites are something that AMGA has always had. Prerequisite skills are listed. A student is required to climb a certain number of reps at a certain grade. They're a certain age, or they've been climbing for a certain amount of years or something like that. And so those are prerequisite skills. And we've had those for a long time, and they're a great element to students or kids applying or participating in programs. The next pillar of those three are the program efficiencies. And so that's something that back in 2020, the Mountain Guide program developed for assessment categories. So within risk management, the students will be able to do all of these things. So proficiencies are another great way that start to describe the characteristics, things we're looking for within the assessment category. So that's been a huge advancement, and we now have all the proficiencies for the SPI program. And so those are listed for each assessment category. So when a provider is wondering, things didn't seem to go too well risk management, they ought to be referring to those proficiencies and comparing the student's performance with what is listed in that document, and then that's how we can start to formulate our scoring scale. The third pillar, and something that AMGA doesn't have, but I'm really excited to just kind of that we're developing. We have a small committee working on, myself included, right now, essential eligibility criteria. And so essential eligibility criteria is something that is also going to be shared with students prior to the program, and it helps them know whether or not they can do the tasks that are going to be required. So if, say, on an Alpine guide program, maybe we would write an essential eligibility criteria. Students need to be able to hike up to 12 hours a day for 9 days in a row. That would be an essential thing that people need to be able to do, and they can for that. It's tangible. Another, maybe more relevant to the SPI, would be able to independently tie an overhand or figure eight knot, or any of the knots stated in the handbook. So being able to do that independently. And so we're not saying you need to do it a certain way, but they just need to be able to tie knots independently or belay and somehow manage that break independently without someone helping them. And so these are these essential criteria, something I've been working on with some help from some adaptive advisory that I got some input from, I want to say a little over a year ago, and also now we're getting some support from the Mountain Guide program, and there's been some good progress in this, and we're hoping to have these things available in the coming year. We're also, AMGA is working on a new website. We're going to hopefully be transitioning to a new web platform in 2025. And so within transition, members can likely expect to see essential eligibility criteria in a similar time frame.
Wow, that's a lot of work there.
Yeah, I mean, it's going to be interesting. We're trying to figure out how to formulate that, whether we're going to have, the EECs for each discipline. We're going to have EECs for risk management or things like that. But the hope is it'll just open the door to people who maybe just didn't think they could participate in a program. And it's just better clarify things. And that's my hope. And it's really exciting. It's a really exciting project.
So you said that opened the door for people who don't think they can participate in the program. Is that because people were overwhelmed by?
Yeah, some of the perspective I've gotten has been from the adaptive climbing community, and maybe someone's missing a leg. They have an amputation and they're missing a leg to a certain extent. They might not think they can, meet all the requirements. But if we have the EECs, we can better clarify what's expected, what they can expect on the program. Hopefully that will kind of better clarify things so they can make a decision whether or not they're able to meet those expectations. And many organizations have these EECs and have been developing them in recent years. And so it's exciting that AMGA is going to be doing the same thing here soon.
Can you repeat what EEC stands for again?
Yeah, the EECs are the essential eligibility criteria.
Awesome. Yeah, so these are all the questions I thought of, and because I try to keep these type of episodes really short and concise. But at the end, I would love you to share anything you want to share or some interesting stats within the program.
Yeah, I mean, interesting stats. Well, first off, I'd refer any of the listeners to the AMGA website. If you go to the AMGA.com, there's a programs tab. You can click on SPI programs. There's a Google Drive link. You can actually download the program handbook. So if people are curious about participating in an SPI course or taking that step in to becoming a professional climbing instructor, download that handbook, take a look through. You can email me, Andrew at AMGA.com. Happy to chat with folks. But yeah, I mean, some interesting stats. Well, I'm really excited. We recently just wrapped up a BIPOC SPI course in Boulder here, and that's the Black Indigenous People of Color SPI Affinity course. And that's one of the really exciting things that AMG has been doing since 2018. I want to give a to Montserrat Alvarez, who is a huge advocate and proponent of spearheading these initiatives at AMGA back in 2018. She had a big hand in this. And so we've linked up with some corporate partners. I know you've worked some of these programs well, Ting Ting for AMGA. So yeah, some of our corporate partners, we've got the queer, the LGBTQ, IA2S plus SPI course. That's sponsored by Mountain Hardware. The BIPOC SPI course is sponsored by Black Diamond. Women's Rock Guide course with the North. The Women's SPI course and assessment with Arc'teryx. And yeah, I think overall, I pulled up a few stats here from our annual report, but I think over, the years from 2018, these corporate partners have donated over $150,000 in scholarships. So if any listeners identify with these groups, we really encourage you to head to the AMGA website, apply for a scholarship. We're past due on the scholarship period for this year, but people ought to look out around the start of the new year is when we typically announce those scholarships. People can, and the scholarships are generally what I'm referring to as the tuition being covered by these partners. And just a couple other stats, we've had over 230 participants in affinity programs. So that's from all of those affinity groups. And we've offered over 34 programs since 2018. So it's a really cool thing. These corporate partners AMGA believes in. I think it's so important, and we've really gotten a lot of help from providers, Ting Ting. So thanks for that, and all the other providers who've worked these as well.
Yeah, thank you so much, Andrew, for coming to this interview. And I learned a lot about SPI program, and I'm hoping, and I'm confident, and I'm hoping that the SPI program keep improving.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that's my mission. It's exciting to be a part of it. And yeah, thanks for having me here today. It's great to chat.